So again, I'm here with Brian Solis, and I want to move into kind of the second part of my interview with him about X the book. Again, here sponsored by IBM Commerce today. And we were just starting to go through kind of what is customer experience design and what is journey mapping and some of the broader trends and issues around it. But it seems to me that the biggest issue that we have to face, and the people who are going to be watching this and who are participating now face, is that there's a lot of challenges that still need to be overcome. While it is a zeitgeist moment, and this is finally seeing its day in the sun, and something that you and I have been talking about for a decade, and we've been talking about probably separately for 2 decades or more, and many of us have been looking at, is now coming into a reality and coming into focus. So I was hoping that we could spend a little bit of time focused on the challenges that are out there and that you see that people need to focus on, and maybe come up with some of the solutions for some of them. So what is the real biggest challenge that a customer experience architect, or the many people who actually serve as a customer experience architect inside of a company, actually face today, and how might they potentially overcome it? What is the biggest problem that they have in making their organizational leadership buy into this?
Oh man, where do you start? This comes down to I want to say organizational psychology, but it's just basic psychology, right? I mean, there's 2 things. One is you have egos, politics, fear, cultures being risk averse. You have businesses that are modeled after the 50s and 60s that are much more structured with layers. They're not meant to be dynamic. They're not designed to be dynamic. You have a management infrastructure that manages rather than leads. So this you have just a lot of stuff to work through. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but what the challenge is that there's a zero lack of urgency to do anything, because most companies are really profitable today, and once they're not, then you're in a whole different discussion. And so there's this when you're risk averse, why start taking profit away and then making these investments if there's no sense of urgency? And so it really takes anybody to rise up to make the case. And a lot of that is done through hypothesis, to whether most of the times it's finding friction points where conversions are just either stalled or declining. And so there's an immediate opportunity. For example, Walmart, when they built their innovation lab, one of their first things was to say, how do we increase e-commerce? What are some of the friction points in e-commerce today? And they also had a grander aspiration, which was, how do we compete against Amazon? And not necessarily making e-commerce just an extension of the Walmart store, but actually a competitor to Amazon. And so they started partnering with startups. They started to get a whole new different perspective of what's possible. And in the first 12 weeks of one of their first pilots, e-commerce sales went up 20%, right? So you got to imagine that's a pretty sizable payoff, but it was also very focused. The same with Starbucks. When they started experimenting with mobile and mobile payments, they just started with very small pilots, and they were able to get buy-in around that, as saying, we could do this, it could solve this, it could generate this. And then that's an easier way to do that, right? So, for example, journey mapping allows you to see what parts are broken, and then you could hyper focus on one thing and get some buy-in around showing what's possible. And then there's a little bit of you bypass a lot of the politics and the human aspects of it, simply because there's, well, if we did that, what else could we do? Then from there, though, you really have to develop a lot of momentum, because as you can imagine, now once you journey map, you're crossing over a lot of fiefdoms within the organization today, and you're going to have to be a great politician to start to partner with those folks, right? So the best experienced architects don't wait for that job to be given to them. They go and take that job, and they have an apologize later, act first sort of philosophy. And it's scary, but if you think about what's scarier is losing your job because your company goes
very much so. Well, everyone has a different risk tolerance, of course, which is a big part of it. But it sounds like that really we're dealing with the same sorts of challenges we've faced for change management and digital transformation for the last several decades, and that if companies have been through that, then they're probably in a pretty good position to actually embrace the idea of customer experience design and the broader concept of X as a holistic approach, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. Because look, people don't want products; they want experiences. That's if you study. I mean, I spend all day, every day, studying people and behaviors and trends. And the thing that is fascinating to me is that they don't. This digital generation is the first to not have a brand handed down to them, right? They're the first that are really rethinking everything. They want things their way. They want it to be experiential, and a lot of businesses are still selling products and services. Some of the better brands are great at branding, but it's still not the same as experiences, right? Because it's still, from the productization to the support to what have you. I mean, they're not consistent around that. It's just great marketing. But I think that, to your point, if you can even just take a step back and be able to answer the question of what's the experience that somebody's supposed to have and how would they share it.
So you actually,
most
in the
people don't
book, you
fail
talk
at
about a couple of companies who have done this well, who have been through this, Sephora and actually Rail Europe, among others. What was the one that really stood out to you when you were looking at people who have been through this experience and embraced the broader concept of customer experience design and the holistic approach to the journey mapping? Who's actually the ones that really stand out in your mind out of all the case studies?
Oh my goodness. Well, I do talk about, you know me, I'm not one to be big on case studies because I don't want it to, to that old conversation you and I had, I think I think it was Sweden, where you said, there is no box. I still give you credit to that, to this day, because case studies tend to put people in a box. But I will give you an example of one company and why I think it's great, and that's Lego. And there was a time that Lego was on the wrong path, and so much so that there was a real chance that Lego was going to lose everything. It was bleeding so bad that they brought in a company called Red Associates. And Red Associates is this really interesting breed of consultancy and social scientists, if you will. And they really studied sort of what the problems were. And they studied kids, they studied parents, they studied just household scenarios, and they found all kinds of really interesting things. And one of the things that they had learned was how kids use Legos and how they want to use Legos are very different, and how parents think about Legos and how they put Legos on their kids are very different. And what they learned was there's two journeys. There's the child's journey, or not even the child, but let's just say the Lego user journey.
Chasm model,
the Lego buyer journey. And yeah, absolutely. And so they were able to figure out that those two journeys, and then the experiences that were happening versus what should have been happening in those journeys, was the problem for Lego at the higher end. The products it was making and selling, how they were marketing them, how the company was structured around them. And so they went through this massive transformation because, unfortunately, it's a hard one because they were bleeding so bad that there was a sense of urgency. But whether you have that sense of urgency or you don't, by doing this type of work, you get to the same outcome, which is relevance, better products, better business models, better experiences, etc.
So I always thought that the reason why Lego got turned around is because Chris Pirillo got back into Legos, but I don't know.
No, he's
very much so. Hey, a quick shout out to Ross Quintana, who's been dropping some great knowledge inside the comment stream. I just want to say thank you, Ross. I am paying attention, but trying to get through these questions that I've got for Brian here. And in fact, I want to do one more here on the challenges and the opportunity very specifically, because this is one we've also talked about a bit over the years, and I think is more challenging today. When I was talking with Doug Folds, who's the product manager for the Journey Designer, who's going to be on episode 1, considering this is like the pre-show to set it all up next Wednesday. One of the things that they talked about when they were developing their empathy maps for the product was that their key persona was a woman named Anne, who was essentially your customer experience architect that they were designing for. But that what they found through their research was that in most situations, there isn't a customer experience architect yet. There's not somebody who has that responsibility. Now, I would think the CMO should be taking that role, but we know generally they're not. They're still trying to wrap their hands around data science, let alone all this other stuff. In some cases, there's exceptions out there. But when we look at this, that typically what happens is there are multiple people who constitute a single and so the real challenge that I see in all of this is the coordination that has to happen between all these different teams, particularly as we now move to the different pathways and touch points and moments of truth. And ultimately, I've heard some people think omni-channel is a buzzword, and I understand why, but it really does describe better, I think, any other way to approach it. How actually somebody moves up and down across these different touch points. So how have you seen companies manage that coordination well in terms of overcoming those challenges? And I'm really looking for very practical answers if you have any.
Well, I'll give you a practical answer, but to get from here to there, it's really hard work, right? I mean, this is where the Sephoras and the Starbucks are really great examples, because they had to change how they work inside the company in order to be the company that they needed to be on the outside. So practically, they looked at the journey. They looked at the most important parts of the journey where things were broken, and they started to work to fix that, right? So if you think about the journey, there's no real beginning, middle, and end. It's ongoing. It's like an infinity loop, and I talk about that in the book. But typically today, there are different groups of departments that are responsible for different parts of the journey. And so practically speaking, they don't collaborate. That's why things are broken. 90% of customers have to switch devices and channels to keep going through the journey, because it's like duct tape and stuff designed in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And then you get social media and the whole, and then you get mobile, and that further causes chaos. So what they started to do is, look, if these are problems for the customer, how do we solve them? And it's usually somebody, or it's some people who get together, or an executive sponsor who says, collaborate. You got to work together. The baton has to be passed, right? Or can it be solved for in this one moment? And this is why omni-channel is a buzzword, because no one wants to take the omni-channel challenge on. So the people like Sephora who are doing it right are just looking at fixing the friction points first. And then once they do that, once they've established some history of working together, they start to say, well, why aren't we just working together? And every successful company, and none of them would say that they're fully transformed, they will say that they are transforming, has essentially formed new marketing teams where these disparate groups now start to collaborate together, and they also bring IT into it. So we call it the MIT group. So where marketing meets information technology, where parts of IT stop operating against this roadmap about how to work more efficiently with technology, and how to apply it for better.
I actually am curious about this myself. So you actually hit on this a little bit earlier. I'm gonna go up to a higher level, back to the selling for a second, because it's still that challenge that's out there, which is about when people are doing well, and this is a Tony Robbins thing that I'm sure you're familiar with. When people are doing well, they tend to party, and when they're doing poorly, they tend to ponder. And it's when that pondering happens that these self-reflective moments come where they're willing to try new things. So if a company is going along and doing very well, or seemingly that they're doing well according to their own metrics, even though they don't necessarily see, the storm looming on the coast, what sort of other things might actually motivate them to look at customer experience as something that's needed, if just knowing the opportunity and the opportunities in front of them isn't enough?
Yeah, I don't know. It's different. It's all. This is dependent on the culture of the company, right? What is the thing? If it's a sales organization, if it's employee morale, organization. A lot of times, I see success happen in sort of mini money talks. A lot of times, so it's either like, hey, we're losing money here, or we could make more money here. That tends to get people to listen. Or problem points within the organization, like we're losing market share here to this person, we're losing share of voice, we're losing shelf space, depending on the organization, right? If it's business to business, our customers are moving away from our customers, and we're starting to witness the dwindling of that of purchase orders. There's just so many reasons, but the ones who tend to win look at the problems. because problems create a sense of urgency, and they tend to kill the party, like that old school record needle scratch. Like, what do you mean this is an amazing party?
That's
What
really good.
happened?
I like the way you phrase that. That's really important. We're going to switch over here in a minute to get to an audience Q&A and do more of a traditional blab. And Ross, I hope you're able to join in here. But before we get close up with this episode of CXP Now, setting the stage, I want to actually look to the future for a little bit and kind of close on that question. And specifically, we know that this is important, and we've been talking about this for a long time, but it hasn't happened fully yet. The holistic approach to business, the need to focus on experiences, the need for deeper customer empathy, as you've written throughout the book, the idea of understanding across the multiple channels, all of those moments of truth, the zero moment of truth, the first moment of truth you talk about in X the book. What is really needed right now that we don't have that would help the companies who are starting to go down this road, who are actually starting to embrace journey mapping and starting to focus on customer experience design, whether it's because they recognize the opportunity, they're solving their problems, or they have an external market competitive challenge? What do the people who are doing it now on the edge need to help advance this movement and do it more effectively?
Well, tools, journey mapping tools are a great place to start. Indulge me just for a moment, because I had part of the process of this book, right? The irony is not lost on me that I'm telling businesses to change and create better experiences, and I put it in print form, right, in a digital economy. So I want to use myself as an example, because I didn't feel right writing a book about it. So, I see Ross talking about hacks. I thought, what would be the best way to communicate an answer to that question you just asked? And it was to unlearn in order to learn. It wasn't just learn, it was unlearn. And by that was the hardest. It was so almost humiliating and darn right depressing, to be honest with you. Because I wanted to think that I was at this point in my career where I just needed to keep publishing and keep writing books the way I always have. Certainly easier, because it's hard to write a book. And instead I said, well, what should a book be in 2015? And how would you make it relevant? How could you make a print book relevant in a digital economy? And so I studied UX. I studied how people use apps like Tinder or some, or Duolingo, or, all of these things where it's immersive, entertaining, engaging, but also informative, educational, what have you. You learn a lot about behaviors and expectations and manners. You learn a lot about how long people can focus on something, and how you write sentences and how many you put together until you need white space, or until you need, could you take a paragraph and use it as a visual instead, and recreate the book to be an analog app. So that's where people need to start, is unlearn, take a step back, and appreciate all that you don't know. And then there's empathy does a marvelous thing. It inspires you at a very human level to want to be relevant, to be needed, to be significant. And that's why the book, it's a real interesting, it's just, that's why it looks the way it does. It's the way it feels the way it does. That's why we got rid of the table of contents. That's why there's a lot of, you'll see structurally, there's a lot of visualization and a lot of app flow in it, but because it was wireframed, it was UX, but more so, it's why I didn't just talk about journey mapping. It's why I brought all these other disciplines in, because I realized that once you started to see things from a very human perspective and build it back up, you can borrow from all kinds of things that make it much more meaningful. So before you even get to journey mapping, if you appreciated the art of storyboarding from Disney or Pixar, and what that meant and how they develop characters. So from a persona development, if you borrowed from Hollywood in order to develop personas that were meaningful and human, and then put together storyboards that For example, I thought storyboards were just ways to just put together a string of sequences to see if they work together as an inexpensive way of before production. It turns out that it takes Pixar 4 years to put together a movie because this particular part of the process, if the people don't matter to you, if the characters don't tug your heartstrings or get you mad or inspire you, and if the story doesn't bring you up and then make you cry and then make you feel like you can take on the world, that's all of that was done before the production ever took place. So I had to learn a lot too. I had to unlearn not just how to write a book and how to retell it in a book format, but also what would you put in it? What would inspire you, and how would you think about not the path that CX is on, right? But how would you completely take all that you learned and say, maybe you're not even on the right path. Maybe you could just think about these things and pave your own path. And then, because the relationship between you and your customers is yours, right? I see somebody talking about IDEO here. I even talk about the human-centered design process that IDEO uses. And I stitched them all together to say, these are the best things I found, but there are multiple things. Do it your way, but just work in this way, because the relationship you're trying to build is yours, and yours alone. And this is why I tended not to fill it full of case studies. There are case studies in there, but the case studies aren't holistic. They were in each part to show you what it could look like as you move forward. So that was it for me. It changed.
Yeah.
It changed.
Well, that's really great, because what you're really talking about here is to challenge our fundamental beliefs. And there's a little Buddhism in here about practicing detachment. We get so attached to how things are and what they are that it's really very difficult sometimes to let go of that. But in fact, I was going to go ahead and share the ending of the book, but the way it culminates in the last bit is just so poignant to this point about how we make so many assumptions we don't even know what they are really anymore. And I don't think we should give it away, just to be clear about that. But it really is about this matter about the power of questions and what that means, which of course, given my new company, is really important, because I believe that's one of the things that society is missing. We don't ask good questions. We don't know how to ask for help. And so that's really important as we start looking at this. But I see we've actually kind of run out of time already, and I've got 12 more questions. So we're not going to be able to get to those. But we are going to be able to wrap up here. And then I want to open it up to bring in a full Q&A session with all of our guests. We've got Ross Quintana, who's been sharing some great insights over here with us, among others. And for those of you who are just tuning in, again, I'm here with Brian Solis, author of X the Book, on Customer Experience Design Now, CXD Now, with much thanks to IBM Commerce and the Journey Designer team. We'll talk more about them on our next episode on Wednesday at noon Pacific, where I'll be live with Doug Folds, who is the product manager for them. And we'll be talking about some more of these things relative to their journey to building a better journey mapping and journey designer product. But thank you so much for joining us, Brian. Please stay with us, and we'll do some Q&A now that we're finished with the interview. Thank you.